Welcome to Construction Estimating. I like to say I'm really excited to have you in this class, and I tried to create a really good course for you this semester. To start out, I just want to go over an overview about estimating. Some of this information you should have went over in your first estimating course, but just wanted to kind of touch bases over it again. For the first few objectives, let's just look at this. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to list and briefly describe the different functions that are served by estimating in the construction industry. And then what I like to do is just briefly describe the cost planning process. And maybe you understand the process, maybe you don't. But there is an actual process step by step that you need to understand. And it also coincides on the design side as well. So we'll look at that, and that would include the conceptual estimate and also preliminary estimates, and trying to identify, what is the difference between conceptual and preliminary estimates. Then you should have already discussed this in your Intro to Construction class, and you have a pretty good idea of what I mean by when I say project delivery methods. But I do want to touch bases on it. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I want to make sure that we do understand the different types of project delivery methods that are out there in our construction industry. And these are just some of the basic project delivery methods. There are other ones that are in use today. Then also want to just talk about the various type of estimating contracts that you'll get into, such as the lump sum, unit price, cost plus fee. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and last, just outline the detailed estimating procedure. So going forward, let's just kind of talk about this. What is an estimate? I kind of look at it as, say, for instance, you had a jar and it was full of jelly beans, and in grade school you kind of went through that activity where you had to guess how many jelly beans are in the jar. Well, when we think about that in terms of, I guess to say that's more of a guesstimate. We look at it in terms of construction. There's a little bit more that's involved with it. In fact, there's a lot more that's involved. And I want to take the time just to break down things as simple as I possibly can. And that's one thing I really want to concentrate on doing this semester is let's try to make things simple. And let's not overcomplicate things. Let's go to what we know, and then we can move forward, okay? But when we do think of, what is an estimate in regards to construction, it's really just a probable total cost of a future activity. And I don't know if you've had scheduling course or not. You learn in scheduling that there are activities that you will do in order to finish up a project, starting all the way to site work, going into your framing and finishing it out and closing out the project. There are all of these different activities that will have to go on. Now, when we look at the estimate, it occurs in all of the industries and government agencies. So across the board, when we think about estimating, it is something that's done. It doesn't matter what sector that you're in. It could be the residential, commercial, industrial. Every sector has their own way of doing their estimating. There is a basic principle behind estimating, and we'll talk about those various things throughout the semester. But at the end of the day, each sector, they actually do have to do an estimate on that job before actually beginning. When we also think about estimating, we want to anticipate something. We want to know, how much is this going to cost? And that's very, very vital for a owner, because they're going to be the ones that actually come up with the funding, and we want to make sure that we are staying on budget. And if you go over budget, then you're going to lose that connection with the owner. So it's very important for us to get a good understanding of what each activity, all the details that are going to go into that activity, how much is it going to cost, and then even on the scheduling side, looking at, how long is it going to take to do this particular activity. And all of that plays a role into looking at the labor and the cost of everything. Now, if we look at this, we can look at it from a basic approach. And if we were to just break this down and keep it simple, we'd always know that you need to identify your work items to be completed. You want to measure your work item sizes, and then also just assess the likely cost of work, okay? And there are various ways that you can do this stuff, but like I said, we'll keep this as simple as possible, and then as we go through the semester, we'll learn more and more about it. So just kind of breaking down the basic estimating approach, I have a little bitty small scenario here, and we're talking about identifying the work items to be completed. So here we say a crew will be needed for a full hour to place 7 cubic yards in the footings, and then also to place the 12 cubic yards in the slab on grade. So if I were to ask you identify what are the work items that we're talking about here, well, the first thing we know is we're talking about footings, and then we're also talking about slab on grade. There are a couple other things that we can identify in this scenario, and that is it says a crew, so we are considering that this is a crew, and you're going to need this crew for, let's say, a full hour, because that's how long it's going to take to do what is described in this scenario. So if we break this down a little bit further, and we started talking about measurements, that was the second note or bulleted item. It says that there are 7 cubic yards, okay, for the footings, and then a slab on grade, there's 12 cubic yards. The other thing to note is that, like I said earlier, 1 full hour and a crew, okay? So that's a way of measuring. You're looking at the fact that it's 7 cubic yards, so I'm giving you some sort of measurement. Another way you can do measurement is looking at how long it's going to take to do something as well, so you can actually measure that, okay? Then we look at the labor, okay? So we say here that there's going to be 1 crew, and let's just say that it's $190 to do this per hour. So labor is $190 per 7 cubic yards. And then the same thing with the 12 cubic yards. And then you'll get what we call a unit cost. And you're just breaking it down individually, showing that this is about roughly $27.14 per cubic yard, okay? So this is just kind of giving you an idea of when we do start doing estimating in this class, and you start doing problems, and I give you your semester project to work on, there are going to be certain things that I'm going to ask for, and I expect to see. I want to expect to see what your activities are. I want to expect to see some sort of measurement, and then seeing who is all involved with this particular activity, how many people are involved with getting it done, and of course looking at the overall cost and how that's going to turn out per unit. So this is, I would say, if you just keep it simple like this throughout the semester, it really helps out, okay? Now, the one thing that we will say is that there's a huge importance of scope of work. For the most part, if you do not have a scope of work, then you really don't know what all of the details will be to get that job completed. So when you know that you have a scope of work, it is going to include that of the drawings and also of the specifications that are going to be in your project manual that goes along with your contract. And this is a really good saying. The most accurate way to predetermine the cost of construction work is by means of a detailed estimate, which would require a scope of work. At the beginning process of when we start talking about the process of estimating and building along this path, because it is really a journey. It's not just a one-step shop. There's this process of the beginning stages, which is very conceptual. In the conceptual stage, it's very vague when you think about the information that you're given. And one of the key questions that you're going to ask at this stage is, do the financial risks fall within the area of budget for the owner, and will the project financial feasibility provide more of a benefit than a financial loss in the long run? And really what you're looking at is that overall return on their investment. And when we say their investment, we're talking about the client at the end of the day, okay? So let's talk a little bit more about the conceptual estimate. With the conceptual estimate, we're talking in terms of at the design stage. And this is where the owner is meeting with the design engineer, the architect, whoever the case may be. But there's a project team that's going to come together, and they're going to form what we would call a conceptual estimate, and this is during that conceptual design stage. And generally, just so that you know, it's before the construction drawings and the specifications are actually made available, because you really won't have drawings and specifications completed until it gets more into that preliminary side and you get past the schematic designs and get more into design development. And definitely you should have them by the CD stage, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about this here in a minute. Just a few things so that before we go forward, a really well-developed conceptual estimate, it's going to be typically based off of historical information. Most companies, they have information that they have documented over the years. They have projects that they've worked on. They're very similar, so they keep that information, and it only makes sense to do that. Another thing is just looking into project feasibility studies that will be done. And again, just looking at previous projects that you've worked on, it kind of helps out with doing some of those feasibility studies. And the other thing that you're looking at products as well, and also the financing the finished products. You know, the clients, they're going to come to you as the architect, and they're going to have some thoughts behind, you know, what they expect, and they have a vision. I believe at the end of the day, the owners, they do have a vision. There are some owners that are very clear about what they want, and they're very detailed, whereas there's other owners, they're very different in that they're not 100% sure what they want. Maybe if they see it, they'll know, and that's where the designers kind of come in to help out with this area. And sometimes in some cases, it could be also, if it's dependent upon the project delivery method, the contractor as well, okay? So moving forward here, just kind of reviewing over some of this that I have bulleted on this slide. With a conceptual estimate, it produces the owner's notion of the construction, but like I said, it does lack design detail. It's very schematic at this stage. And some of the primary factors that affect project feasibility, it's going to be value and also the cost of development. So these are just some of the things that you can kind of look into, and I wanted to share just a few examples when I say conceptual and some of the tools that are utilized to come up with a conceptual estimate. This right here is actually done with Revit, and it's very three-dimensional, but it does give you the overall look and feel of what the building will look like in the future. There are even a few estimated costs that are on this as well. And, you know, if I were the owner and if I were to see this combination of, you know, design and a little bit of the conceptual estimate to go along with it, it would really open up my mind of, oh, okay, you know, this is what it will look like, and, you know, this is kind of the ballpark figure for overall how much it's going to cost to do this project. And it really does add to that fuel for discussion. One of the big things that I think is very, very important for you to learn about in construction and also architecture is process. A lot of times, you know, what you will see is the finished product. So if you go out and you look at a building, you're seeing the finished product. What you don't see is this process that goes along, unless you've monitored the project yourself on a day-to-day basis. Most of the time, we just see the finished product. There is this process that you must go through. There is a sequence that you have to go through in order to be successful overall. And doing the design and then also doing a little bit of the estimate. It kind of goes hand in hand. I think that as an architect, you have this idea in your mind of, oh, I want to design this really neat project. But then there's the cost and the budget that's involved. And so then you got to go back and tweak your design just so that you're fitting your budget and not going over the expectations, or not necessarily over expectations, but you're not coming in talking to the owner in a way of, oh, this is what I'm presenting, and it's entirely too much. So I think that there is this the great idea of doing a great design, but then there's this reality check. And I think overall that's what estimating really does do overall when I look at construction. It does paint this reality check of, hey, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. This is what's going on in our industry today. These are the numbers. And you're either going to have to work with it or not. And there are a lot of things that come with that. This is another slide for showing you a different example using Revit. But it's a little more detailed than the other one that I showed you. It shows you some of the windows and some of the other exterior features. But there is a price breakdown that you can see here. And it's not super detailed, but it does give you kind of an overall view of how much it would cost to do this particular project. Some of the other things to just consider when you're talking about the conceptual estimate, we want to also look at cost of land, which can be fairly easy with so many of the market studies that are out there that you can use. There are so many different tools that are available now, whether you get your own marketing consultants or you buy your own particular software for marketing. But there's just a lot that's out there to help you out to figure out cost of land, cost of financing the project, the legal and the general administrative costs that go into a project, designing and administration, the construction costs, that's a whole other area. Some of the additional costs that you should consider is commissioning. And commissioning is something that's not just at the very end, because a lot of people will say, oh, commissioning is just closing out, making sure that you understand how you operate and do the maintenance for this particular project. But there's some other upfront items that you need to look at as well with commissioning. Operating costs, and also, as we had stated earlier, some of the marketing costs. Now, this is something that's actually in your textbook, and you can just look through here. It tells you basically the stages, or to say the phases that you would go through from the design side, and also that of the estimator as well, and the various tasks that they're going to do as an estimator. And if you look at it, we've talked so far about the conceptual side. And when we say program, a lot of people are like, what is a program? Program is very simple. It's basically your owner is getting with the designer or the architect, and they sit down and they just figure out, hey, what are we going to have in this building? I'm going to have 3 bathrooms. I'm going to have 3 classrooms. I have to make sure that I have a conference room, a tech place. You're just really laying out the basics. What do you want to have? What is your program? And you're laying it out. Then you can get into the schematic side, which is more of designing. And just, coming up with some basic numbers. Then what happens is once we really are to that point and we figure out, this is what I want. It may not be 100%, which it never really is ever 100%. But it does say, I think that financially we can work through this. I like the design. I like the concepts that you're showing me. And you may have 3 concepts, and you may have to narrow those concepts down. But that's kind of what we're talking about with the conceptual side of it, okay? Now, I'm going to refer back to that table, but one of the big questions that we're going to ask once we get into the preliminary estimate. So if we look at this, the preliminary estimate is right here in the middle area, okay? So that's where we start talking about preliminary estimating. Here we need to ask ourselves the question of, should I proceed with the venture, okay? And you know, this might be an area where people might back out, and you may have this great idea, but if it doesn't work with the owner, they might just actually decide, no, I think that we need to look into something else. But it does signify that the perceived benefits really do justify the project cost. Going forward, just a little bit about preliminary estimating. It's really prepared in that design development stage, or what people call the DD stage. Here, you're going to find where you're working more with having and forming a floor plan, elevations, and maybe even a few little details, you know. That information is then forwarded on, but for the most part, this does give you a chance to come up with, you know, a preliminary estimate. We have a little bit more detail. It's not so vague anymore. It does inform whether design meets the budget. It provides alternative design cost information, so you could do some comparison and a little bit of value analysis of, okay, yeah, we could go this route, or maybe this route with using this type of material. And then you can really just sit back and justify, yeah, you know, this is really going to work, and I think that the owner overall will really like this particular approach. So there's this back and forth thing that goes on for a little bit until everything's kind of figured out on the cost side and what products would the owner like to use. And then there's a little bit of subdividing that you can do also when it comes to the preliminary stage. So going forward here, when I say subdividing, you're really subdividing things in what we call assemblies, and you're trying to basically make groupings of your building components. So you're going to start out where you have your substructure, and then the superstructure, then we get into the exterior cladding, and of course the interior partitions and doors. And all of this really is the set of prices for elements that's going to be referred to as the cost plan, okay? So, you know, there's a little bit of a difference there. So when you're thinking about, you know, what's conceptual, it's very vague. It's, you know, at those beginning stage. And we get into preliminary, we have some more depth to this project. And when we talked about the scopes of work at the beginning of this lecture, we're beginning to identify some of the various scopes of work in the preliminary stage. It's also a couple other things. With the main overall categories, the preliminary estimate, you kind of get into the various techniques here. Everybody does their estimating a little different, okay? There's some people that say that they really do like to do their estimate by hand. Then there are some people that are like, you know what? I have this software that I can use, whether it's Plan Screen, Virtual, On-Screen Takeoff, whatever software that you're using. And it can easily just take a PDF, scan it, and you can figure out very fast, you know, what are going to be your overall estimate for this project. Now, the one thing that is important to realize is that you will not know the overall cost for your project until the very end, okay? So even though I have a conceptual estimate, a preliminary, and then I get into more of a detailed estimate, I'm really not going to know that overall cost until the very end of that project, okay? But all of this is really, you know, it's great. You know, it's like you coming up with a game plan ahead of time so that you're able to work through how are you going to make payments, how are you going to stay on budget. All of this is going to help out, and coming up with those techniques, it really helps out a lot. Now, some of the really big things that are going to overall influence your estimate and preparing the estimate are going to be the project type, the delivery system, and the overall nature of the delivery system contract, okay? This right here is just a figure that kind of breaks down, or it does break down, all the different sectors. So it started with residential, commercial, and goes all the way down to civil engineering projects. And it's basically showing you what are the various estimating methods that are used for those different sectors, okay? And we know that our project delivery systems, and we went over this in Intro to Construction, but there's going to typically be what's called your traditional delivery method, where you do your design, bid, build. Here you basically are, you have a project where it's going to start out with your owner and also the designer. It's going to be hired, and then also you're going to have the contractor that's going to come in to bid on that particular project. Then we have the construction management delivery method, where this in this area can be somewhat of a consultant to the owner, but there's a little bit of overlapping here between project stages, but it does allow for earlier completion. Then so for instance, when I say earlier completion, you see a lot of fast track type projects that do CM type projects, okay? And then we have the design build, which a lot of people really, really do like design build, because it's like a one-stop shop. You don't have to go through so much of, the communication. It doesn't have to go to the estimator, to architect, to contractor. There's just one place where you can go to get answers, and that's really helpful. Usually there's going to be one lump sum, and of course that all depends upon your contract type. But it is a single organization that assumes responsibility. So we find that people tend to work a lot better when you're doing this project together instead of it being separate entities. Now, your textbook does a good job of just kind of showing you some overall diagrams of how this is broken, I guess to say the breakdown of the different project delivery methods. And this one is the traditional design, bid, build. It shows you the owner on one at the very top, and it goes over to the side where it's talking about the architect, even though it says prime consultant. But we're talking about pretty much on the design side. And then you go to the other side, it's talking about the construction side, and then the subcontractors that come into place with that. Okay. The next one is what we had described earlier, which is the CM delivery system. There is somewhat of the same, like I said, it's an overlap. It's somewhat of the same type of concept, but then again, it's not. A lot of times you would hire someone as a CM consultant, and they come in and they're not whatsoever going to be actually building, but they're their eyes, the ears. They actually work with the contractor that's actually hired to do the job and making sure that they stay on track to get the project completed, okay? So this is a different type of approach. A lot of educational institutions use the CM track. You see it a lot at universities, but it is out there, and it's a great way to do fast track delivery. And the last one, of course, as I stated earlier, is design build delivery system, which is really being favored right now in our industry. So the last thing I wanted to talk to you about would be the different types of contracts. So we have lump sum contract, and that's probably the one that you're most familiar with, and that's where you have one overall sum of how much it's going to cost to do the project, okay? And everybody clearly understands what is their scope of work for that particular project, and then you come up with one lump sum. And then there's the cost plus contracts. This particular contract can be very favorable towards the contractor, but not so much to the owner, because what we're saying here is that, if there are any cost overruns for this particular project, then the owner would be out of pocket. So they're going to give you a cost, all right, but if you go over a little bit, then the owner is going to have to pay for the extra expense, unless it's the fault of the contractor in any kind of way. So a little bit of a different thing with a cost plus, really a cost plus a fee type of contract. Then we have our unit price contracts, which we typically see a lot more on the heavy civil side because sometimes it's very hard to always know how much something's going to be and put your, say it's going to be exactly this amount because who knows what it'll be within a 6 months or a year down the road. You see a lot of this with, like I said, heavy civil type projects, but it is measurement and payment. It's based on pricing schedule. There's a breakdown of the work, and also you see a lot of the estimated item quantities, okay? And it does also enable owners to do competitive pricing as well, okay? So the last thing here that we'll talk about is just overall detailed estimates. If we were to go back, and I'm not going to do it right now, but if you were to go back to that one drawing diagram that talks about the different phases for the whole entire project and also what the estimator's role will be. It does talk to you out underneath the preliminary stage about detailed estimates. And if you think about it, when you have all of this information, you have the scopes of work, you have the overall drawings in your hands, you know pretty much, some of the ins and outs. You were able to go out, maybe even to visit the site. Then you know that you can do a more detailed estimate. And in those stages, you've got quantity takeoff, recap quantities, pricing the recap, pricing the subcontractor's work, pricing general expenses, and summary and an overall bid to go out the door. I want to say overall, when it comes to estimating, it's not necessarily an easy thing, but like I said, if you keep it simple and you don't overcomplicate things, I think the process goes well. Everybody, if you were to talk to a company, they have their own estimating setup, okay? My goal for this class is that I just want to make sure that you have a good overall understanding of what does it take to do a detailed estimate? So we'll go through some of the basic exercises, but then I'm going to give you a semester project that you're going to work on, and you are going to have to take the time yourself to do all of these steps that we're talking about here. I really do look forward to working with you, though, more in this class as we go through overall the conceptual estimate, preliminary estimates, and detailed estimates. I think that we stand a lot to learn from each other as well. There may be some people that have actually done internships in estimating, so sharing your experiences and maybe some of the different things that you did there at that particular company, those things are great to learn about. But I look forward to working with everyone this semester, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you.